Snow White. In the palace, everything looked tidy and calm. But that calm was held together by habits, not by joy. The queen loved order, silence, and her reflection in the mirrors that surrounded her, because they reminded her who she was and what she possessed. Every morning she stood before the largest mirror in her room and asked the question she already knew by heart. Mirror, mirror on the wall, tell me who is the fairest in all the land? Her voice was confident because for a long time the answer never changed. You are queen, the mirror replied. Your beauty has no equal. That was enough for her. In that same palace lived Snow White. She was not someone who searched for attention, and she rarely appeared in the conversations of adults. Most often people saw her in the garden with the servants or by the windows where she watched the world outside. Snow White grew up quietly. She didn't try to be noticed. She didn't compare herself to anyone. And she didn't know that her presence was beginning to change something the queen believed was secure. One morning the mirror hesitated. The queen repeated her question, but this time the answer came more slowly and it did not sound the way she expected. You are beautiful, queen, the mirror said, but Snow White is more beautiful than you. The words stayed in the air longer than they needed to. The queen did not raise her voice. She did not shout. She did not make a scene. From that day on, the mirror was no longer just an object. And Snow White, without suspecting anything, continued her days as before, unaware that someone else's mirror had noticed her. After that conversation with the mirror, the queen changed nothing outwardly. But the queen began to look at everything differently. Every smile from Snow White, every kind word spoken to her, became a quiet reminder of the answer the mirror had given. She did not speak about it. She did not confide in anyone. One afternoon she summoned the hunter, a man who knew the forest better than anyone and who rarely asked questions when orders were given. You will take Snow White for a walk in the forest, the queen said calmly, as if speaking about something ordinary. She needs fresh air. The hunter nodded, but he did not answer right away. There are places you do not return from easily, the queen added without looking at him. Those words were enough. Nothing more had to be said, because the meaning was clear. The next morning Snow White set out with the hunter. She walked peacefully, enjoying the trees and the unfamiliar paths. The deeper they went, the heavier it became for him. When they reached a quieter place, the hunter stopped. Snow White looked at him with surprise, and for the first time she noticed that something was wrong. Why are we stopping? She asked. The hunter drew a deep breath. The order had been given, but the decision no longer felt simple. He stood still and stared at the trees as if searching for an answer among them. Snow White watched him carefully. She stopped talking because she understood this was not an ordinary pause on a walk. The air felt thick. The silence was strange. Something is wrong, isn't it? She asked after a moment. The hunter sighed and finally turned toward her. In his eyes there was no anger, only weariness. You should not have come here, he said, and I should not have been given this task. Snow White did not understand everything, but she understood enough. The queen? She asked softly. The hunter nodded. That small gesture was an admission that he could not continue on the path he had been commanded to take. I can't do it, he said. Whatever she expects from me, she won't get. Snow White stood silent, but fear did not freeze her. Instead, she felt something else. She was no longer a child who simply followed. What will happen to me? She asked. The hunter pointed toward the forest. You will have to go alone, he said. Go deeper as far as you can. Don't come back. Then he took the knife from his belt and placed it on the ground as if to say his decision was final. Snow White looked at him one last time, then turned and walked between the trees. The path disappeared quickly behind her. The sounds of the palace were far away now. She did not know where she was going, but she knew one thing. There was no going back. The forest did not welcome her like a place from fireside stories. Snow White walked slowly because she knew that hurried steps could push her even deeper in the wrong direction. She tried to remember the hunter's words, not as a threat, but as care spoken in the only way he knew. With each step, the palace felt farther, less real. Here there were no mirrors, no commands, no one deciding for her. There was only silence, broken by rustling leaves and distant noises that made her glance around more often than she wished. When darkness came, fear appeared not as panic, but as tiredness. Snow White sat beneath a tree, pulled her knees close, and tried to breathe. She thought of the palace gardens and voices that now sounded distant, and she realized that what had frightened her before seemed smaller than the unknown around her. And still she continued because she had no other direction. Somewhere ahead between the trees, a light flickered, not bright but different from the darkness around her. Snow White stood and walked toward it, hoping it might be a place where a person could stop and breathe. After a little while, she saw a small house hidden among the trees. It was not large and not rich, but the windows glowed softly, and that made her feel calmer for the first time in a long time. Snow White sensed she had reached a place where she would not be alone. She approached carefully and knocked, but no one answered. When she peeked inside, she saw a table with a few small chairs, little beds, and everything arranged as if someone cared for the home each day. Children must live here, she thought, and smiled. She went in because she was tired and because she did not feel danger. She tidied a little, washed the cups, and sat on one of the beds without intending to stay long. Not much later, footsteps and voices sounded outside. The door opened and 7 dwarfs came in. They stopped, surprised, because they did not expect to see anyone. "Who are you?" one asked. "I'm Snow White," she said. "I got lost in the forest." The dwarfs looked at each other, then back at her. They saw nothing frightening, only a girl who needed help. "You can stay for a little while," said the oldest, "only until you rest." Snow White nodded gratefully. She did not know how long she would stay, but she knew this small house was the first place where her fear began to loosen. The next morning, Snow White woke early because she was used to days beginning that way. The house was quiet, and sunbeams came through the windows, lighting the small furniture. For a moment, she looked around to remember where she was. Then she smiled because she was no longer alone in the forest. The dwarfs gathered around the table, each with a cup, watching her with curiosity. They weren't used to someone new living with them, and they wanted to know what would happen now. "We have a few rules here," said the oldest dwarf. "Not hard, but important." Snow White nodded and listened. "We keep the house tidy," said another. "That sounds familiar," Snow White said with a smile. "I can help with cleaning and cooking, if you like." The dwarfs looked at each other, and for the first time since meeting her, they all smiled at once. "Then you can stay," said the oldest. "But you must be careful. The forest is not always safe." Snow White promised she would not open the door to strangers and would not wander far alone. Those rules did not scare her because they came from care, not from fear. When the dwarfs left for work, Snow White stayed and began to arrange the home. For the first time in a long while, she did things that mattered and that someone noticed. And even though the house was small, there was space in it for calm and for new habits that slowly began to feel good. Days in the small house began to pass in the same rhythm, but they were not dull. Each morning the dwarfs went to work and Snow White stayed to care for the home. She cleaned, cooked, and arranged, but now with the feeling that she was in a place where effort mattered. When the dwarfs returned in the evening, the house was warm and smelled like food. They sat around the table and told stories about their day. Snow White listened with interest because every story brought something new. "Today we found good stones," said one. Snow White served dinner and smiled. She felt she was no longer a guest, but part of their small world. Sometimes after dinner, she stepped outside and watched the day fade. The forest looked kinder when she was not alone. The sounds did not frighten her the way they had on the first night. I like it here, Snow White said one evening. And we like that you are here, the oldest dwarf replied. Those words brought her calm even though she knew her past had not vanished. She began to believe she could have days that passed quietly and in order. One morning, before the dwarfs left for work, they gathered around Snow White more seriously than usual. Today we want to remind you of something important, said the oldest. Even if it feels calm here, the forest is still the forest. Snow White nodded. If someone knocks, said another, don't open the door. I promise, Snow White said, I'll be careful. The dwarfs checked the door one more time and left. Snow White stayed alone as on other days, but this time their words remained in her mind longer. She began to tidy, then stepped outside briefly to fetch water. The forest looked peaceful. Birds sang. Nothing suggested danger nearby. Later, while she was inside, someone knocked. Snow White froze. She remembered the dwarf's warning and went to the door without opening it. Who is it? She asked. A voice answered, friendly, calm. Just a traveler, the voice said. I want to rest for a little while. Snow White hesitated. The voice did not sound threatening, but the warning was clear. I'm sorry, she said, I can't open. Silence followed. Snow White stayed by the door a moment longer until she was sure everything was quiet again. Then she returned to her work, determined to remember the words spoken out of care. Not long after, another knock came, softer, patient. Snow White went to the door and looked through the small window. Outside stood an older woman with a basket in her hands, bent, tired, wrapped in her shawl. Good day, child, the woman said softly. I have fruit from the forest. I only want to rest a moment. Snow White hesitated. The woman did not look like someone to fear. Her face was calm, her voice slow and quiet. I can't open, Snow White said. I promised. The woman sighed and shook her head. I understand, she said. Children today are more careful. But look what a lovely apple I picked. It would be a shame to waste it. She raised one apple, red, shining, and held it up to the window. Snow White stared. It had been a long time since she had seen such fruit. Just taste it, the woman said. Nothing will happen. Snow White hesitated once more. She did not open the door, but she reached through and took the apple. The woman smiled strangely and stepped back. Enjoy, she said. Snow White shut the window and stood with the apple in her hands, thinking how danger sometimes comes not with noise and threats, but quietly and patiently. She sat at the table, turning the apple, admiring it. It looked like something from the palace garden. For a moment she remembered the dwarf's words, then pushed them aside, certain that one bite could not be wrong. She took a small bite. The taste was sweet, then everything turned. The sounds around her grew distant, her strength began to leave. Maybe I'm just tired, she whispered. She tried to stand, but her legs did not obey. She sank onto the chair, then slowly down to the floor, as if falling into deep sleep. The house grew still. Hours passed. Snow White lay unmoving, breathing calmly, as if only sleeping. Outside, birds continued singing. The sun moved across the sky, unaware of what had happened inside. When the dwarfs returned that evening and opened the door, an unusual silence greeted them. They found Snow White on the floor, peaceful but not waking. Snow White, one cried. There was no answer. The dwarfs looked at one another and understood. The warning had mattered, and danger had been closer than they thought. They didn't know what to do. They called to her, touched her, tried to make her open her eyes, but she did not respond. She isn't gone, said the oldest dwarf, but she isn't waking. They lifted her carefully onto a bed. Then they decided to do something that would keep her safe. They carried her outside to a place where light could reach, where they could stay near her at all times. They made a clear, protective coffin so they could see her and know she was safe. Days began to pass more quietly than before. The dwarfs worked less, spoke less, and often returned to sit near Snow White as if their presence could help her. "She will wake," one said. The forest around the house seemed different too. Birds landed nearby. Wind moved gently between the trees. Time itself felt slower. Sometimes travelers passed, stopped for a moment, and asked what had happened. The dwarfs answered briefly, then returned to their waiting. Snow White lay peacefully as if her sleep was deep and guarded. And even though no one knew when she would wake, everyone believed this sleep was not the end of her story. One day, while the dwarfs were at work, a young prince walked along the forest path. He had heard stories about a sleeping girl among the trees. He stopped out of curiosity, but when he saw her, he understood this was not just a tale. This was a real person waiting to wake. He stepped closer carefully and leaned towards Snow White. At that moment, one of his servants stumbled. The coffin shook slightly, and the piece of apple lodged in Snow White's throat came loose. Snow White drew a breath and opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the trees above her and faces watching her with relief. She sat up slowly, not fully understanding what had happened, only feeling that the heavy weight inside her was gone. "Where am I?" she asked. "Safe," said the oldest dwarf, "and awake." When the dwarfs returned and saw her alive and smiling, their joy was bigger than words. They understood their waiting had not been in vain. The prince did not rush with promises. He spoke with Snow White, listened to her, and told her who he was, without pushing her toward anything. And Snow White, more confident than before, knew that whatever she chose would be her own decision. As for the queen, the mirror had nothing left to say. The truth had moved beyond her control. Snow White did not forget the dwarfs or the forest because there she had learned what care and patience mean. And the new path began, not as a loud celebration, but as a calm choice. So the story ended not with noise, but with something more important.